What if I told you that Ferrari left the Australian Grand Prix with a feeling that no one expected? Surprise? Because throughout the weekend it seemed that the Italian team had the pace to fight for everything, even to control the race if things went well. But as the Grand Prix ended and they began analyzing the actual lap-by-lap pace data, an uncomfortable truth emerged. Mercedes had been hiding something. His race pace was better than Ferrari thought, enough to completely change the reading of the start of the season. And most shocking of all is that Lewis Hamilton, in his first real experience competing with Ferrari in racing conditions, ended the weekend by acknowledging something that no one expected to hear so soon. The challenge was much greater than he imagined. What exactly did the Australian GP data reveal? Why did Ferrari end up surprised by Mercedes' real pace? And above all, what did Hamilton discover about his new Ferrari that could change the course of the season? The Australian Grand Prix not only marked the start of the season, it was also the first moment in which the teams were able to measure their true level in real racing conditions. Throughout the preseason there had been talk of an extremely even grid, with McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull separated by very small margins. But Melbourne was going to be the scene where some of the first truths of the championship would finally be revealed. And for Ferrari, that revelation came accompanied by a rather unexpected sensation. Over the weekend at Albert Park, there was moderate optimism within the Italian team. The simulations, training data, and the driver's feelings indicated that the car had potential, not necessarily to dominate but to fight face-to-face with direct rivals. That confidence was supported by several factors. A car that seemed competitive in long runs, good tire management, and a general balance that allowed the drivers to attack without compromising too much on degradation. All this suggested that Ferrari could start the season with a strong result. However, Formula One has a very particular way of testing expectations. And in Australia, complicated conditions and strategic decisions began to play an important role from the start of the Grand Prix. The race took place in a complex context, with difficult asphalt, moments of rain and constant changes in the driver's pace. This forced all teams to adapt quickly, manage tires carefully and make strategic decisions under pressure. In the midst of that initial chaos, Ferrari had moments that seemed to confirm its good feelings. The drivers managed to stay within the front group and the pace seemed enough to stay in the fight. But as the race progressed, something began to become clear to the engineers analyzing the data from the wall and from the factory. Mercedes was lapping slightly faster. It wasn't a huge difference nor something that was easily noticeable from the television broadcast. In fact, on the track everything seemed quite balanced. But when long-run lap averages were analyzed, a clear trend emerged. The German car had a small but consistent advantage. On average, Mercedes was lapping around 1 minute and 23.233 seconds. While Ferrari was around 1 minute and 23.431 seconds, representing a difference of close to 0.2 per lap.in Formula One. 0.2 may seem insignificant to the casual viewer, but within the paddock that margin is enough to determine who is truly in control of a race. A car that is 0.2 faster at sustained pace has the ability to manage strategy more freely, protect track position and force its rival to take more risks to try to make up ground. That was exactly what Ferrari began to understand once the full race data was on the table. The SF26 was not far off Mercedes' pace. In fact, it was close enough that I thought the fight would be constant throughout the season. But it was also far enough behind that, under normal conditions, the German team would have a slight strategic advantage if both teams ran clean races. And that discovery was what left Ferrari with a curious mix of emotions as he left Melbourne. On the one hand, there were positive signs. The car was competitive, was within the performance window of the best and had the potential to evolve. But on the other hand, the analysis revealed something they did not expect to see so soon in the year. Mercedes wasn't just back. He also had more pace than many thought. That reality not only changed the internal perception within Ferrari, but also made it clear that the start of the season was going to be much more complicated than it seemed during the tests and the first sessions of the weekend. Because if the Australian Grand Prix had shown anything, it was that the true competitive order was still beginning to reveal itself. And within Ferrari, there was someone who understood that lesson especially directly: Lewis Hamilton. But what the 7-time world champion discovered during that weekend would go far beyond mere Mercedes pace. In fact, his experience in Australia ended up becoming a true crash course in what it means to compete with Ferrari in real Grand Prix conditions. Once the race was over and with all the data on the table, Ferrari began to reconstruct exactly what had happened during the Australian Grand Prix. Because for much of the weekend the feeling within the team was very different from the conclusion left by the final numbers. On the track it seemed that everything was relatively balanced. Ferrari was close, the drivers could fight, and the car showed no serious weaknesses. But when the engineers analyzed the complete runs lap by lap, a reality emerged that had not been so evident during the race. Mercedes had a slightly higher base pace and had maintained it consistently throughout the long stints. That detail was key to understanding why the development of the race ended up favoring the German team. In Formula One, the car that seems faster at specific moments does not always win, but rather the one that can sustain stable performance throughout the entire race distance. And that was precisely what Mercedes managed to do in Melbourne. During the first rounds, the battle seemed completely open. In fact, there were times when Ferrari even seemed capable of controlling the situation. Charles Leclerc made a very aggressive start and managed to get into direct fighting positions with the leaders, which generated the impression that the SF26 had everything necessary to challenge for control of the Grand Prix. Those first laps were a real exchange of positions between the leading drivers, an intense fight that fueled the idea that Ferrari could set the pace for the front group. But as the race began to stabilize, the landscape slowly began to change. When the tires entered their most constant phase and the cars began to run with less fuel, the real pace of each car began to show itself more clearly. It was then that Mercedes began to build that small advantage that would end up being decisive. The race pace data showed that the two Mercedes were the more consistent cars over long runs. Both George Russell and Kimi Antonelli managed to maintain a very stable pace, without major drops in performance between laps, which allowed them to better control tire wear and manage the strategy more calmly. Ferrari, for its part, was within the same performance window, but always with a slight disadvantage when the stint stabilized. That kind of difference is extremely difficult to detect during the race itself. From the wall or from the television, two cars separated by just a few tenths seem to be in total equal conditions. But within the paddock, everyone knows that this margin can be the difference between attacking or defending, between controlling a race or being forced to constantly react to what the rival does. And that was exactly what ended up happening with Ferrari. The Italian team found itself in a situation where it had to chase Mercedes' pace rather than dictate the course of the race. Every strategic decision had to consider the rival's position. Every pit stop had to be adjusted to what the German team was doing, and every stint had to be executed with precision so as not to lose that small margin that Mercedes seemed to have under control. This scenario generated a very particular feeling within the team, because on the one hand Ferrari was clearly in the fight. The SF26 was not a slow car, nor was it far from the performance of the leaders. But at the same time, the analysis revealed that the true competitive order may not be exactly what many expected after the preseason. Mercedes had shown more performance than expected, and he had done it precisely in the most important aspect of winning races: sustained race pace. So when Ferrari left Melbourne, the feeling within the team was not simply frustration at the result. It was something more complex. There was concern about that small margin that Mercedes had shown to have, but there was also an internal conviction that the difference was not insurmountable and that the car still had potential to exploit. However, for one of the Ferrari drivers, this race represented something even more significant. Because while the team was analyzing the technical data, Lewis Hamilton was experiencing something very different. His first real shock with the reality of competing with Ferrari in a full Grand Prix weekend. For Lewis Hamilton, the Australian Grand Prix was much more than the first race of the season. It was the first real contact with what it means to compete with Ferrari in full Grand Prix conditions. Tight qualifying, complicated strategy, changes in the weather, and a car that was still in the process of adapting to his driving style. And when the weekend ended, Hamilton himself made it clear that the experience had been much more revealing than he imagined before starting the championship. Not with the feeling of having been clearly surpassed, but with the certainty that the battle for the car's real performance was just beginning. Because if the first Grand Prix of the season made something clear, it is that Mercedes was not simply another rival in the fight. He had revealed a pace that Ferrari did not expect to see so soon. And if that trend continues in the upcoming races on the calendar, the Italian team will have to quickly find more performance in its car if it wants to prevent that small difference in pace from becoming a much bigger problem throughout the season. The Australian Grand Prix left much more than a simple result on the table. It was the first race where expectations began to clash with the reality of on-track performance. Ferrari arrived in Melbourne with the belief that it had a car capable of fighting directly with the best, and although the SF26 showed clear signs of competitiveness, subsequent analysis revealed something the team did not expect to find so early in the season. Mercedes had slightly better race pace. That difference of just a few tenths per lap was enough to change the dynamics of the race and force Ferrari to react instead of imposing the pace. For Ferrari, the result was a mix of emotions. On the one hand, the car proved to be in the fight, competitive enough to stay close to the leaders and aspire to better results as the season progresses. But on the other hand, the Australian Grand Prix made it clear that the true competitive order of the championship is still beginning to be defined, and that Mercedes has returned stronger than many anticipated. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.